Okay, good morning. Got it. Awesome. So if I haven't met you yet, my name is Amelia Schmidt, and I am the youth pastor here, and I'm also a part of the teaching team. And so we are so excited to be in the middle of a series called What If Jesus Was Serious? And this is taken from this awesome book by Skye Jethani called What If Jesus Was Serious? And if you want a copy, we actually have a few in the back. I think we still do. Nope, just kidding. Well, if you want one, you can talk to me, or you can order one on Amazon. Super easy to find. But in this book, he is going through Jesus' famous sermon called the Sermon on the Mount. And so that's what our series is that we're in now, which is found in Matthew 5 through 7, this sermon. And in his sermon, Jesus gives a bunch of teachings that were kind of countercultural for the day. They were maybe a little confusing for some, maybe hard to hear. And Jethani argues in his book that if we truly believe that Jesus was serious, then why don't we take him more seriously? And so, sadly, more often than not, Christians often ignore a lot of Jesus' teachings or a lot of other teachings in the Bible. And they will pick out what they like, ignore the things they don't like, and they will take things out of context to make it fit what they think. But what would happen if we actually took Jesus more seriously? And we actually took his teachings seriously? Well, if we did that, maybe the rest of the world would also start to take him seriously. And so, as we jump in this morning, would you just join me in prayer? God, we just thank you for the chance to come together and worship you this morning. God, I pray that you would open our ears to what you want us to hear. Would you open our hearts, soften our hearts to anything you want to say to us or anything you want us to change in our lives. God, I pray that you would just be so present and near this morning as we learn more about you and your word. Amen. So in the first week of our series, Mike and Christy started us off by talking about the Beatitudes, which is the first few verses in Matthew 5. And Jesus talks about who is truly blessed. And then last week, Sean talked about Christians and our culture and how we are called to be salt of the earth and light of the world and how we need to engage with culture in order to do those things. And we can't just avoid everyone around us who doesn't believe the same thing as us. Crazy, I know. So that takes us through the first 16 verses in this sermon, the first 16 verses of Matthew 5. So now I have the privilege of going through the next 20. So buckle up. It's going to be a long morning. Just kidding. Well, no. So we're going to be looking at Jesus' teachings on righteousness. And he has a lot to say about righteousness here in Matthew 5, as well as the surrounding passages. And so we're going to call this inside out righteousness. So before we get started, I have a question for you. What's the point of rules? Because boundaries, yeah. Anyone else? Guidance? Order. Yeah. And so, we're going to find rules everywhere you go. You're going to have rules on the road when you're driving. You're going to have rules at work, at school, in sports, at home. Basically, every context you find yourself in will have some amount of rules. So parents will have rules at home to protect their child, even if their child may not like the rules or understand why there's rules. But the parents know that this is what's best for you. I'm caring about you by setting these rules. They're for your safety. I used to be a lifeguard when I was in high school, and there are a lot of rules at pools. It rhymes. But I felt like a lot of my job was just blowing my whistle and yelling at kids to stop doing this or stop doing that. And I may have felt like a buzzkill to them, but that wasn't my job. My job was to keep them safe. We had rules in order to keep them safe. So why was there no running allowed at the pool? Well, because there's water everywhere, and you're going to slip on the water, and cement is hard, and you might scrape your knee, or worse, cut your head open. Who knows? So I just wanted to keep them safe. So maybe you're thinking of some rules that either you have for others or others have for you. Maybe some you like, maybe some you don't like. Maybe you're the kind of person who just doesn't like rules in general, and you're like, don't tell me what to do. Or maybe you're like me, and you love rules. Like, if you ever play a game with me, I will probably read all the instructions and make sure we follow the rules the whole time. I got stressed out playing Phase 10 a few weeks ago because I realized that a rule I played by my entire life is not in the instructions, and it was just, it was a rough night for me, guys. It was really hard. But there was a group of people back in Jesus' day who also really loved the rules. They were really good rule followers. They were known as the Pharisees. And so they did all the right things, followed all the rules. But is that what God actually wants? Well, let's find out. Let's see what Jesus says. So we're going to jump into our first section here for this morning, and that's in Matthew 5:17 through 20. If you have your Bibles, feel free to open them up to that. If you want a Bible and you're here in person, we've got some in the back of the room in that corner. They're also going to be on the screen, so don't worry if you don't. So, starting in verse 17, Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, nor the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." Okay, so there's a lot to unpack in this little passage. But first of all, what is Jesus talking about when he says the law and the prophets? Well, the law was referring to what they call the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Okay, so that's the law, and then when he says the law and the prophets, he's basically saying the entire Hebrew Bible. And there's more in there. There's the writings, the poetry, all of that stuff, but it's just a saying to say all of the Hebrew Bible, which we know as the Old Testament. And in the law, there was a lot of laws, 613 to be exact. Yeah, a lot, I know. But for the Jewish people, they were very careful to follow all of these laws. But for them, it wasn't just a list of do's and don'ts. It may seem like that, especially to us when we see all of these laws. But for them, it was more a way that they showed their love to God, the God who redeemed them. And so them following all these rules was how they demonstrated that. And these laws weren't meant to burden the people. They weren't meant to burden the Israelites. They were meant to protect them and teach them how to love God and love others. However, many leaders and teachers of the law took that and made more laws and did make it burdensome for a lot of people. But let's get it straight right off the bat. The law was not the bad guy, and it still isn't the bad guy. Jesus wasn't coming to get rid of it. He said he was coming to fulfill the law. He isn't coming to abolish or put an end to everything they've been following for their whole lives. No, he was just coming to fulfill them. And that basically means to bring it to completion or reality. So he's wanting to bring all of these laws to completion or to what they're supposed to look like. So basically, it means that he will bring the law to its intended goal, what he desired all along. And so it was really just to show them what the true intent of the law was, what a lot of the Pharisees and teachers and many others have missed all along. N.T. Wright, a brilliant scholar, author, and teacher, said it this way. When he spoke of the scripture needing to be fulfilled, he was thinking of the entire storyline at last coming to fruition and of an entire world of hints and shadows now coming to plain statement and full light. Jesus was just connecting all the dots here, bringing it all together, though they may not have realized it at the time. So it was like he was bringing to color what the Old Testament always intended. Jesus didn't come to abolish the Torah or the law or any of the Jewish scriptures. He just came to bring it all together and display their true intent. In Matthew 22, 37 through 40, Jesus was asked, "What's the greatest commandment? Out of all these laws, what's the greatest?" And he replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commands, to love God and love your neighbor as yourself." He says that all 613 of the laws are summed up in those. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And so as we move forward through the rest of this text, I just want you all to keep that in mind this morning. So back in Matthew 5, Jesus goes on to say something that must have really shocked his hearers and maybe made them mad or really confused. He said in verse 20, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." Yeah. I mean, their response was probably like, what? Like, how do you expect us to do that, Jesus? Because like we talked about, the Pharisees are the rule followers. They were the leaders in the synagogue. They did everything right. They also really valued oral tradition. And so they had even more rules than the 613. Like, Jesus, how are we supposed to follow everything better than they do? Because on the outside, it looked like they did everything right. And they followed all the rules. And it seems almost impossible to do. But is that what Jesus was really asking them to do and telling them to do? Well, first let's look at what the word righteousness means. Because like I said, Jesus has a lot to say about righteousness. The word is used 7 times in Matthew, in just this one book. And in the broad sense, this word means the state of him who is as he ought to be, the condition acceptable to God. The state of him or her who is as he or she ought to be. So basically, it's being who we were made to be. And Mike has talked about this word a few times lately, and he's described it as the God-created soul/goodness. So Jesus is saying, unless what's on the inside of you surpasses that of the Pharisees, then it's not good enough. Jesus is saying that it's not about the actions, it's about the heart. It's about what's on the inside. And this is something we will see played out in the rest of this text. Because Jesus is presenting here an inside-out righteousness. That it starts on the inside with the heart, and then it goes out. And the Pharisees, they focused so much on their actions and looking good and doing all of the right things, but their righteousness was shallow. It didn't go beyond their actions. I mean, Jesus even said in Matthew 6:1, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven." And Skye Jitani, in his book, he says, if Jesus was serious, then there's a difference between doing good and being good. The Pharisees knew a lot, and they focused a lot on doing all the right things and appearing good. But that's all it was, in appearance. And Jesus doesn't just want external conformity, he wants an internal transformation. And if the inside is right, then the external will reflect that. Later in Matthew, in chapter 23, Jesus says this, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside will also be clean." So Jesus is saying you can look good on the outside all you want, but if you ignore what's going on the inside, you're still going to be dirty. You first need to clean the inside, and then the outside will also be clean. Proverbs 4:23 says, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." Other translations say, "For it is the wellspring of life." So everything you do flows out of your heart. So if your heart isn't clean, your actions aren't going to be either. And it made me wonder this week as I was working on this. In Ephesians 6, with the armor of God, a piece of the armor is the breastplate of righteousness. And I wonder if it's called that because it guards your heart. And when we guard and protect our heart and make sure that it's clean, then our righteousness that starts on the inside will move to the outside. What flows from our heart then is good and right. So if Jesus was serious, then there's a difference between doing good and being good. Jesus is saying here that it's not about the actions, it's about the heart of the matter. Jatani has this quote that it's a little long, but I want to read it because I think that it's really convicting and good for us to hear. He says, "Very often in religious communities, we are content with adherence to external expectations of conduct and give little attention to the inward posture of the heart. As long as a person appears devout, uses the right words, and participates in the right religious activities, we don't look much deeper. They are often given a pass on their anger, greed, jealousy, bitterness, lust, and bigotry. Such a person might be acceptable in our churches today, but Jesus said they are unfit for God's kingdom. He doesn't merely desire people who appear good, or even those who do good. He wants people who are good. That kind of inside-out transformation cannot be achieved through laws alone." And maybe people are popping into your mind of you're like, oh yeah, I know someone like that. Or maybe you hear that and you're like, yikes. I am that person. Well, it's never too late to switch your focus from your actions to your heart. Because that's what God desires. And honestly, if you do all the right things and you do it with the wrong motives and do it without love, it means nothing. It's literally worthless. Go read 1 Corinthians 13, the passage before it talks about all the love. Because that's what he's saying there. Like, if you do these good things without love, it's like I can't talk. It's like a gong, like clanging cymbals. Like, I don't want to hear it. Because righteousness is not about doing all the right things. Righteousness is not about doing, but about being. Most people, when they hear the word righteous or righteousness, that's what they think of. They think of doing all the right things, being moral, doing everything correctly. But I think what Jesus is saying here is that it's not about what you do, it's about who you are. It's not about the actions, it's about your heart. It's not about doing, but about being. Being who God created you to be. Now, I grew up as a pastor's kid. And as you can imagine, I felt quite a bit of pressure to act a certain way and be a certain way, really to be perfect. Because there were a lot of eyes on me, and everyone knew me as the pastor's kid in my tiny town of 1 square mile. Yeah, very small, I know. But a lot of that pressure, especially as I grew older, just came from myself. And I felt the need to be perfect. I felt the need to do everything correctly and just do it all right. And that went into every area of my life, including my relationship with God. And as I grew older, especially in college, I started to focus so much on doing all the right things. I was working in ministry. I was volunteering in a bunch of areas. I was serving. I never did anything wrong. But in the midst of being so focused on doing everything right, I lost sight of God. Like, honestly, I didn't spend much time with him because I was too focused on doing things for him that I neglected like a personal relationship with him. And it took a long time for me to make that shift from living my life for God to living my life with God. And honestly, I still struggle with it from time to time because I spent so long living that way. But when I struggle with that, I just keep reminding myself of what really matters. That it's the heart, not the actions. About being, not doing. Because righteousness is not about doing, it's about being. So I know we've spent a lot of time on these first few verses here, and we have a lot to go, but it's important for you to understand this before we move on to the rest of it, because really in the next several sections, Jesus is just playing this out. He's explaining what he means here. And he's telling his followers how he wants them to actually live. And so what we see here in the rest of the chapter are 6 different sections known as antitheses. And Jesus starts each one of these with, "You have heard it said that," blah, 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 and then goes on to say, "But I say to you," or "But I tell you." So in doing this, he takes each of these laws and he intensifies it and broadens the scope of these commands. So again, he's not getting rid of the law. Instead, he's just really getting to the heart of each law, showing what he really desires of his followers. And we aren't going to have time to go super in depth on all of these, but hopefully you'll understand what Jesus is getting at here. And so the first one we see is in verses 21 through 22. And Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder,' and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will also be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, 'Raka,' is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in danger of the fire of hell." Okay, so here we see Jesus taking the 6th commandment in the 10 commandments found in Exodus 20. "You shall not murder." And he says, okay, you've heard this one. You all know this one, right? Don't murder, okay? And everyone's probably like, yeah, I know that one. Got that one. Check. Cool. But then he goes on to say, he's like, okay, but now if you're even angry with your brother or sister, it's the same thing. And so he takes the prohibition of not murdering, and then he makes it a prohibition against even being angry. Okay, that's a lot harder to do, right? And you may be thinking, well, anger isn't a sin, right? Correct, it's not. Like Ephesians 4:26 says, "In your anger, do not sin." So that means that it's possible to be angry and not sin. And we see throughout Scripture God being angry and expressing that anger. But the thing is, God's perfect, and he can be angry perfectly, and we are sinful human beings who usually can't be angry perfectly. Because it's pretty rare for human anger to be completely free from mixed motives, desiring vengeance or harm for the other person. So in most cases, anger is a destructive force because we aren't able to see things clearly. And a lot of times anger can hurt another person, even if it's just emotionally hurt them. And so if anger can be so destructive and dangerous, we should do our best to get rid of it in our lives. So why is Jesus saying not to be angry? Well, he doesn't just want us to not murder anyone. He wants us to not even think about murdering another person or not even being close to wanting to murder another person. Jitani encourages in his book to take this to God in prayer. And he encourages you to think about and admit how you've allowed anger to ferment in your heart and mind. And then ask, how have you justified your anger? Are you willing to release your anger to God, who alone can be trusted to see all things clearly? Now, I'll be honest with you. I have struggled with the emotion of anger in my life. Not that I'm an angry person, it's that I'm so afraid of anger. I'm so afraid of being angry. And my whole life I've just avoided it because I thought it was a bad thing. That I'm like, I can't feel that. And so then I didn't know what to do if I ever did feel angry. I didn't know what to do with that emotion. And then I was reading Gentle and Lowly by Dane Ortland. Yes, the book that I quote in basically every sermon I preach. It's just that good. You should all go read it. I'll keep using it, trust me. But he said this in here, and I read it on a day when I was really struggling, and honestly, I was struggling with being angry at someone, and I didn't know what to do with this. And then I read this quote that just brought me to tears. Are you angry today? Let us not be too quick to assume our anger is sinful. After all, the Bible positively orders us to be angry when occasion calls for it. Perhaps you have reason to be angry. Perhaps you have been sinned against. And the only appropriate response is anger. Be comforted by this. Jesus is angry alongside you. He joins you in your anger. Indeed, he is angrier than you could ever be about the wrong done to you. Your just anger is a shadow of his, and his anger, unlike yours, has zero taint of sin in it. And as you consider those who have wronged you, let Jesus be angry on your behalf. His anger can be trusted, for it is an anger that springs from his compassion for you. The indignation he felt when he came upon mistreatment of others in the Gospels is the same indignation he feels now in heaven upon mistreatment of you. Let Jesus be angry on your behalf. And like I said, I was really struggling when I read this, and I was angry because of someone who did something against me, who did sin against me, and that deserved anger. But knowing that Jesus is angry alongside me, and even angrier than I could ever be because of how his child was hurt, I felt the freedom to let him be angry for me and to release that to him. And I was just filled with peace when I did that. And so if you're feeling angry this morning about something, I encourage you just to release that to God, because he cares so deeply for you. And he can be angry on your behalf, on behalf of his child that he so deeply loves. So after this statement about not being angry, Jesus also says to his hearers, don't even call them raka. Don't say to your brother or sister raka, or call them a fool. And raka is an Aramaic term of contempt. And it's an insulting word that was derived from the sound of clearing spit from your throat. So essentially hawking a loogie. Yeah, so that's what you're doing to people when you say that. And so this is like beyond anger. It's arguably worse, because contempt is essentially diminishing the inherent value of a person, viewing them as subhuman and not even worth my anger. Dallas Willard said, "In anger, I want to hurt you. In contempt, I don't care whether you're hurt or not, or at least I say so. You are not worthy of consideration one way or the other. We can be angry at someone without denying their worth, but contempt makes it easier for us to hurt them or see them further degraded." And we need to recognize that every person is valuable. Every person is made in the image of God, and then treat them as such. Jesus is wanting us to value life here. And not just in not taking life, not murdering someone, but seeing people as valuable and treating them that way. It's about the heart and seeing everyone as made in the image of God. And so it's not just about not murdering, but getting to the heart of the law and not even desiring to hurt someone, not even desiring to murder them, and to view and treat them as valuable and made in the image of God. It's the motive and the heart behind the action that really matters. So the second section that Jesus has here is verses 27 and 28. You've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So again, Jesus takes one of the 10 commandments and he intensifies it. So it takes the prohibition to not commit adultery, and he takes it a step further, saying, if you even look at someone lustfully, then it's the same thing. You've already committed adultery with them in your heart. And so Jesus is saying, like, if you just don't even lust, then you're not going to commit adultery. Like, it's not even going to be on the table or an option for you. And so he's calling us to recognize those thoughts long before they even become actions. And he even gives a couple examples, a couple metaphors to illustrate how we need to take drastic measures to prevent this lust and adultery. He says, if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go to hell. Again, this is a metaphor, okay? Don't go out there and gouge out your eyes and cut off your hands, because really, people who are blind can still lust. And you can still commit adultery with a hook for a hand. Or no hands, okay? So eliminating body parts is not going to change a wicked heart. And Jesus is saying here that we just need to take drastic measures to avoid sin in our lives, to keep yourselves from sinning, to avoid temptations, to sexual sin and all other sins. And so removing anything that could cause you to sin. He wants us to look at what's going on in our hearts first, because everything we do flows from our heart. So if you get rid of the lust in your heart and in your mind, it will prevent the sin of adultery and all other sexual sins. It's the motive and the heart that really matters here. Now, Jatani has illustrations that he, like, for each point that he makes in his book. And if you read it, you'll see them. They're really funny. I like them. But he had this one in there that I really liked, and I think it demonstrated this really well. So he says, like, you've heard it said, like, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. Okay, that's great. Do those things. But Jesus wants more. He wants you to desire no evil. And that's what he's getting at here. He's like, okay, yeah, I don't want you to murder. I don't want you to commit adultery. But I don't want you to even want to do those things. It's not just about not doing it. I want that internal desire to not even be there. So Jesus goes on in verses 31 and 32. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So here, Jesus takes the prohibition against divorcing without a certificate, which we see in Deuteronomy 24, and intensifies it to a prohibition against divorce except for sexual immorality. Now, here, Jesus is essentially just calling his followers to a life of integrity, especially in their marriage. One commentator, Janine Brown, said he's shoring up the stability and integrity of lifelong monogamy, thereby protecting women from the whims of a dissatisfied husband. Because back then, men could divorce their wives for anything. They didn't need to be a good reason. Just if they were like not making them happy anymore, or they don't like the way they clean or cook, like they could just divorce them. Literally, all you needed was a certificate. And that was it. And the men could just toss the women aside and move on with their lives. And so here, Jesus was protecting the women, saying, like, no, it's not just that you need a certificate. It's like, don't even do it. Don't do it except for sexual immorality. because he's wanting his followers to understand the seriousness of marriage and what it's supposed to be. And now I also want to add here, and think Jesus would fully agree, that abuse in the marriage is also a reason for divorce. And it's also not just the man who can divorce. Back then, yes, it was. But if you ever find yourself in a marriage or in a relationship where there is abuse and where you feel unsafe or your kids are unsafe, you need to get out of there. And I will tell you that Jesus would not want you to stay in a marriage where you are not safe, where you are being hurt. Okay? Got it? And if that is you, please talk to a pastor here or another trusted friend or someone in your life so that you can get some help. And also, if you have been divorced, Jesus will always meet you there with love and grace and forgiveness. And that does not make you less than or ruin you or any of those lies you may have believed. Okay? Like, Jesus loves you no matter what, and nothing is going to change that. So the fourth statement Jesus gives, in verse 33, he goes on to say, "Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made.' But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is God's footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one." So Jesus takes the command to fulfill all your oaths made to God, and he intensifies it to a command of just saying to keep your word. You don't need an oath to keep your word. And swearing here doesn't mean cursing or using bad words. It's talking about saying something is true and calling on God to judge oneself if it's not. And Jesus is saying, don't swear an oath by any of these other things because they all belong to me, and so that's less binding than swearing it to me. But he says, don't even swear or make an oath by anything. Just say yes or no and stick to your word. He's calling his followers to be men and women of their word, ones who follow through on what they say they will do or don't do. A former professor of mine at Denver Seminary said in one of his commentaries, Jesus' followers should be people whose words are so characterized by integrity that others need no formal assurance of their truthfulness in order to trust them. We need to be people of integrity, both in our words and our actions. But that integrity must start inside. It starts in the heart. And then it will reflect in what we do, that inside-out righteousness. Because righteousness is not about doing, it's about being. It's not about doing good or doing the right things. It's about being right and being good. That God-created soul/goodness in us. Now, there's two more statements that Jesus makes, but you're going to have to come back next week to hear more about those. But hopefully you're understanding better what Jesus is trying to say here. That it's not about the external righteousness, it's about the internal righteousness. It's about what's in our hearts and our motives that are more important than our actions. And he's saying that we're going to need more than just rules to be a godly person. And in all of these intensifying statements that Jesus gives, he's really just setting up guardrails for his followers. So Jatani talks about this in one of his little devotionals in the book. He said that, to think about how guardrails are used on the road. I mean, they're meant to keep people safe and on the road, not to drive off into a ditch or go off a cliff, but to keep them safe. And so the 10 Commandments and other laws in the Bible are meant to keep people safe, to show people what they should do and not do to stay on the road of following him. And these guardrails are meant to keep you and your whole community safe, because these laws are about loving God and loving others. So how to function in community with one another and to love one another. However, guardrails are not enough. They may keep an out-of-control driver from going off a cliff, but they aren't going to teach you how to be a good driver or to be like a professional race car driver. Because guardrails are good, but it's better to become a driver who doesn't need the guardrails. Jesus doesn't want his followers just to stay within the confines of the guardrails, just stay on the road. He wants us to be good drivers. He isn't merely interested in good behavior. He wants us to be good people. He wants more for us than just following all the rules, than just appearing good. He wants us to actually be good. And he wants us to change from the inside out. Jesus is more concerned about the integrity of his followers, and he desires an integration of both the inner and the outer life. So are you so focused on the rules of following everything to the letter, avoiding any major wrecks in your life? Or are you more focused on becoming a better driver, a better follower of Jesus by focusing on the heart and not just the actions? Because righteousness is not about doing, it's about being. As I've studied this passage the past few weeks and the surrounding passages and this word righteousness, there was something that kept standing out to me. And it started with the Matthew 5:6 in the Beatitudes, where Jesus says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." And I kept asking myself, what does that look like? What does it mean to hunger and thirst for righteousness? And so I did what I always do, and I did some Greek studies of some words and had some fun there. So the word hunger in the definition of the Greek word used here is to crave ardently, to seek with eager desire. And then to thirst for means to painfully feel your want of and eagerly long for those things by which the soul is refreshed, supported, and strengthened. So what would it look like to hunger and thirst for righteousness, to crave ardently, to seek with desire and eagerly long for righteousness and to be who God created us to be? Well, that can't start with your actions. It needs to start on the inside. Jesus says that those who hunger and thirst for righteousness will be fulfilled. They will be filled. So meaning they will be satisfied. When we hunger and thirst for righteousness, for that goodness God created us to be, he will satisfy us. And he's the only one who can truly satisfy us. And when I was ruminating on this passage, I thought of another one, Matthew 6:33, where Jesus says, "But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." So here we see that we're supposed to seek first God and his kingdom and his righteousness. And that's like hungering and thirsting for righteousness. And again, he says that all these things will be given to you, meaning I'm going to provide for you. I will satisfy you. So we need to hunger after him, thirst after him, seek him first, and pursue him in his righteousness. And then as my brain continues, I think of another passage. And I know this is a lot, but I think it's so cool seeing the correlation here. I thought of my favorite psalm, which is Psalm 63. And it starts out with, "You, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there is no water." And then a few verses later, it continues, "I will be fully satisfied as with the richest of foods. With singing lips, my mouth will praise you. Earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you." It's like longing for water in a desert. And I've been in Israel in the desert in 115 degrees, and it is brutal. And you desperately want water. Luckily, I had some water with me. But can you imagine being out there with no water? It's like the psalmist is correlating it to a dying man crying out for water, desperately needing this to survive. And that's how he's saying we should thirst for God and seek him. We're dying and we need him. Because we are dying and we do need him. And then it goes on to say that he will be fully satisfied as with the best pizza. I mean, the richest of foods. My bad. In all three of these passages, we see these themes of hungering and thirsting and seeking for righteousness and for God, as well as being filled, satisfied, provided for. And when we seek God and his kingdom and his righteousness, we will be filled. We will be satisfied in him. Worship team, you guys can come back up. And so what would it look like for you to do that this week, to seek God, to hunger and thirst for him? That's going to be different for each person. Because each person is unique, and the way you connect to God is going to be unique as well. So maybe it's going to look like just setting your timer for 5 or 10 minutes and just sitting and breathing and being with God. And not doing anything, not reading, not praying, just being with him. That's been a practice that I've been doing for the past few weeks, and it's been so good. Or maybe it's going to look like going on a walk and enjoying his beautiful creation and spending that time in prayer and just talking to God. Or maybe it's just reading a psalm a day. You can start with Psalm 63. I can't tell you the amount of times that I have prayed this psalm and also prayed, God, I long for you. I want this to be true of me, but right now it may not be. So just starting with something even so small, little ways of seeking God and hungering and thirsting for him and recognizing that you desperately need him. That he's the only one who can satisfy. And this all starts on the inside. It's about being who God created you to be. And ultimately, that's with him. He created you to be with him. Not do for him, be with him. And our actions are going to reflect what's on the inside. Jesus desires internal transformation, not just external conformation. Righteousness is not about doing, but about being. It's an inside-out righteousness. Let's pray. God, we thank you just for your word this morning, just for the richness there and how you pull all these things together. God, I pray that you would create in us a desire for you, that we would hunger and thirst for you, that we would hunger and thirst for righteousness, to be who you created us to be. God, I pray that you would just take our focus from what we do, from appearing good, and that you would help us to be good, to focus on our heart. Because, God, you don't look at what everyone else looks at. You don't look at the outside. You look at our heart, and you know our heart. And we also thank you that you still love us even after knowing what's in our heart. So God, I pray that we would be people who are focused on an internal righteousness, focused on being good, being who you create us to be, because that's what you desire more than actions, more than doing all the right things. You desire our heart. So God, we give that to you this morning.